Did J.D. Vance end up embarrassing the Trump administration during the Iran talks, as Tehran moved quickly to portray the U.S. position as exposed and weakened? The 21-hour-long talks have failed without a breakthrough, and Iranian media is squarely blaming what it calls excessive U.S. demands for the talks' collapse. Are America's unreasonable demands now exposing exactly what Trump could not achieve militarily, with Iran claiming Washington tried to win in talks what it had failed to secure through force? An Iranian embassy account mocked the United States for what it portrayed as crawling back to negotiations. What comes next after the apparent collapse of the talks is now the central question, with Iranian reports indicating that Tehran still wants to keep its position firm. The U.S. Iran talks held on April 11 in Islamabad now appear to have collapsed without a deal, after both sides failed to bridge major differences despite a marathon round of negotiations. Iranian media is now reacting strongly after 21 hours of negotiations failed to produce any breakthrough, portraying the outcome as proof of how deep the divide with Washington still remains. Iran's press TV blamed what it called unreasonable and excessive demands by the United States for the breakdown, arguing that Washington's position made a workable framework impossible. Contentious issues such as the Strait of Hormuz, Iran's nuclear rights, and other disputed matters are being blamed for the failure, highlighting how many of the core disagreements remain unresolved. Iran's state broadcaster IRIB said U.S. demands stalled the talks despite multiple initiatives from Tehran, presenting the collapse as the result of American rigidity rather than Iranian unwillingness to negotiate. IRIB reported, and I quote, "The Iranian delegation negotiated continuously and intensively for 21 hours in order to protect the national interests of the Iranian people despite various initiatives from the Iranian delegation. The unreasonable demands of the American side prevented the progress of the negotiations. Thus the negotiations ended." Unquote. Iran's Tasnim news agency said there would be no change in the situation at the Strait of Hormuz, signaling that Tehran is not prepared to ease pressure on the vital waterway without major movement from Washington. Tasnim also indicated that the Strait of Hormuz is unlikely to reopen unless the United States agrees to what Iran considers a reasonable deal, making the waterway a central point of leverage in the negotiations. According to Tasnim, Iran even urged the American side to accept what it called reality, suggesting that Tehran believes Washington must adjust its expectations if it wants any diplomatic breakthrough. Iran repeatedly presented new initiatives in an attempt to break the deadlock over key demands, Tasnim reported, showing that Tehran wants to project itself as engaged while still resisting pressure. A source told Fars news agency that the United States was trying to gain through talks what it had failed to secure through war, a line that sharply reflects Iran's hardened public posture after the negotiations stalled. Fars correspondent in Pakistan also said Iran did not accept what it described as excessive U.S. demands, underlining the deep mistrust and major gaps that continue to separate the two sides. Iran's foreign ministry spokesperson said no deal could be reached despite numerous messages being exchanged, confirming that intensive communication still failed to bridge the central disputes in the talks. Esmail Baqi said, and I quote, "In the past 24 hours, discussions were held on various dimensions of the main negotiation topics, including the Strait of Hormuz, the nuclear issue, war reparations, lifting of sanctions, and the complete end to the war against Iran and in the region. The success of this diplomatic process depends on the seriousness and good faith of the opposing side, refraining from excessive demands and unlawful requests, and the acceptance of Iran's legitimate rights and interests." Unquote. Baqi gave further statements and said the talks were held in an atmosphere of mistrust and suspicion, underscoring how deeply strained the relationship remains even as both sides continue to test the possibility of diplomacy. Esmail Baqi said, and I quote, "These negotiations were held after 40 days of imposed war and were held in an atmosphere of mistrust and suspicion. It is natural that we should not have expected from the beginning to reach an agreement within one meeting. No one expected that either." Unquote. Former U.S. State Department Middle East negotiator Aaron David Miller reacted after the Islamabad talks, offering a sharp assessment of the balance of leverage between Tehran and Washington. Miller told CNN that the Iranians hold more cards than the Americans, suggesting Tehran emerged from the failed negotiations with greater strategic leverage. Aaron David Miller said, and I quote, "They are clearly in no hurry to make concessions. It seems to me they still have the highly enriched uranium. They've demonstrated they've weaponized geography, they control and now manage the Strait of Hormuz. The regime has survived." Unquote. No date or venue has yet been fixed for the next round of talks, according to reports citing Tasnim news agency, after the Islamabad meeting ended without an agreement. Iran has also signaled it has no plans for further talks for now, with reports saying Tehran believes the U.S. was looking for an excuse to walk away from the negotiations. Iranian source said, I quote, "The Americans needed the negotiation for their lost face in the international arena and were unwilling to lower their expectations despite the defeat and stalemate in the war with Iran. Iran has no plans for the next round of talks." Unquote. Trump's deputy, J.D. Vance, claimed that Iran's nuclear program was one of the main deterrent issues in the talks, making it clear that Washington still sees Tehran's atomic ambitions as a central obstacle to any agreement. Iran, meanwhile, argued that Trump sent the United States to the negotiating table only after failing to seize control of its uranium, framing the talks as proof that military pressure had not achieved Washington's goals. Subsequently, the top U.S. negotiator left Pakistan after the talks failed to produce a deal, underscoring the breakdown of what had been a closely watched round of high-stakes diplomacy. U.S. Vice President Vance announced that no deal could be reached, but he described that outcome as bad news for Iran, signaling that Washington still wanted to project confidence despite the impasse. Before Vance made those remarks, the Iranian government's handle on X had said that negotiations would continue despite remaining differences, indicating that Tehran was publicly trying to keep the door open even as positions stayed far apart.
Good morning, everybody, and let me say a couple of notes of appreciation. First of all, to the Prime Minister of Pakistan and to Field Marshal Munir, who were both incredible hosts. And whatever shortcomings in the negotiation, it wasn't because of the Pakistanis, who did an amazing job and really tried to help us and the Iranians bridge the gap and get to a deal. We have been at it now for 21 hours, and we've had a number of substantive discussions with the Iranians. That's the good news. The bad news is that we have not reached an agreement, and I think that's bad news for Iran much more than it's bad news for the United States of America. So we go back to the United States having not come to an agreement. We've made very clear what our red lines are, what things we're willing to accommodate them on, and what things we're not willing to accommodate them on. And we've made that as clear as we possibly could, and they have chosen not to accept our terms. Questions?
Sir, Nick Robertson from CNN. Precisely what have they rejected here? Can you help us understand it a little bit?
Well, I won't go into all the details because I don't want to negotiate in public after we negotiated for 21 hours in private. But the simple fact is that we need to see an affirmative commitment that they will not seek a nuclear weapon, and they will not seek the tools that would enable them to quickly achieve a nuclear weapon. That is the core goal of the President of the United States, and that's what we've tried to achieve through these negotiations. Again, their nuclear program, such as it is, the enrichment facilities that they had before, they've been destroyed. But the simple question is, do we see a fundamental commitment of will for the Iranians not to develop a nuclear weapon, not just now, not just 2 years from now, but for the long term? We haven't seen that yet. We hope that we will. Jen.
Was there a framework on anything? And also, did the Iranian frozen assets come up? And did you reach any conclusions on those frozen assets?
We talked about all those issues, Jen, and we talked about a number of issues beyond that. And so certainly those things came up. But again, we just could not get to a situation where the Iranians were willing to accept our terms. I think that we were quite flexible. We were quite accommodating. The president told us, you need to come here in good faith and make your best effort to get a deal. We did that. And unfortunately, we weren't able to make any headway. Preston.
Mr. Vice President, how often did you communicate with President Trump throughout the negotiations? There were reports that there were multiple rounds, where there were breaks in between negotiations. How often did you communicate with the president throughout those rounds, and what was he saying as you were going through these negotiations that you said fell short?
Yeah, obviously we were talking to the president consistently. I don't know how many times we talked to him, a half dozen times, a dozen times over the past 21 hours. We obviously also talked to Admiral Cooper, to Pete, to Marco, to the entire national security team. We talked to Scott Bessent a number of times. So look, we were constantly in communication with the team because we were negotiating in good faith. And we leave here with a very simple proposal, a method of understanding that is our final and best offer. We'll see if the Iranians accept it. Thank you.